Hello, my dear friends. You're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 15th of October of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And during the day, we've been waiting whether the United States of America will announce additional help to Ukraine and will the United States of America provide Ukrainians with Tomahawk missiles, but nothing like this happened. Today, we got report that Pentagon Chief Hexet arrived in Brussels, where a meeting of NATO defense ministers and the Ukraine Arms Contact Group Ramstein would take place. And upon arrival, he called on NATO countries to allocate more funds for the purchase of American weapons for Ukraine, and that's it. So nobody announced that Ukraine will get Tomahawk missiles. Maybe this is going to happen tomorrow or the day after. Maybe today the minister Hexet was talking with European countries and leaders with the purpose to understand whether they're planning to allocate additional funds or not. So today most likely we will not understand anything. Most likely after this meeting, Hexet will turn back to Washington, and then the President of the United States of America will make a final decision. But at the same time, we see that Ukraine continues suffering huge problems with electricity. By the end of the 15th of October of 2025, we got report that almost the entire Ukraine has no electricity. There are just several regions of Ukraine still have some power, and that's it. And obviously, this is the beginning of disaster. We see that the Russians stopped attacking the territory of Ukraine. Most likely, they also see the picture across Ukraine, and the picture is very bad. Furthermore, today we got reports that Ukrainians began preparing of buses and trucks for evacuation purposes. The Ukrainians are evacuating not just towns and settlements along the line of combat contact where the Russians are advancing. The Ukrainians began thinking how to evacuate the entire population of Ukraine from the territory of Ukraine in the direction of Western countries. And we're talking not about several thousands of people, we're talking about millions of Ukrainians. So this is the reality on the ground. Zelensky needs these Tomahawk missiles to begin attacking deep inside of the territory of the Russian Federation, but it seems that he is the only person who understands this need. Most likely nobody else understands what exactly Zelensky is planning to achieve with this. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground, and first let's talk about the Kherson direction. During the previous 24 hours, we got lots of very interesting updates from this territory. Today, several pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian resources reported that Russians began offensive operation in this area, that Russians managed to cross the river of Dnipro and to land infantry on the Karabel 1 microdistrict. So we are talking about this island. This is a part of Kherson, the most southern part of the city, and the sources were reporting that Russians crossed the river of Dnipro, landed infantry, and began clashes for this territory. Furthermore, several pro-Russian resources adjusted their maps, showing that almost the entire southern part is under complete control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. As for the end of the 15th of October of 2025, we don't have any possibilities to confirm this information. Furthermore, several pro-Russian resources reported that those were just speculations. There are no clashes in this area, but at the same time, several pro-Ukraine resources reported that indeed the Russians were trying to cross the river and to land infantry, but the Russians were counterattacked by Ukrainians with FPV drones, and that the Russians suffered losses and their attack failed. Anyway, as for now, it's very difficult to understand who is telling the truth and who is lying. Anyway, if Russians began this offensive operation, they will not be able to hide this offensive operation forever, and sooner or later we'll start receiving updates about this. So as for now, let's wait for another day, and then everything will be clarified most likely. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Zaporozhye direction, where Russians continue their offensive operation. As of this area, there are very heavy clashes. There are still very heavy clashes for the settlement of Poltavka and for the settlement of Uspenovka, but as you can see, without changes on the ground. We need to understand that there are no changes on the ground when talking about different mappers, but most likely currently there are a lot of changes on the ground which still hasn't been revealed or hasn't been published by different sources who are fighting in this area. During the previous 24 hours, we made small corrections of the map in the area of the settlement of of Uspenovka, based on this video that was published by Ukrainian resources. And here we can see how Ukrainians were FPV droning Russians in the area of Uspenovka fortified area. And based on this video, we colored completely the Russian bank, the Russian side of the river of Yanchul. But it seems that the Russians are much deeper in these territories. And most likely in coming days, we are talking about 3, 5, 10 days, we will get additional updates, and most likely and very likely that the village of Poltavka would be captured by Russians during this period of time. At the same time, the Russians continue their offensive operation along the river of Volcha, and as you can see, we have huge changes. According to information we have, the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Oleksiivka. The clashes for this territory started around 3 or 5 days ago, with reports published by pro-Ukraine resources. They added a gray zone in the most southern part. Then we got a video when Ukrainians were counterattacking Russians with tanks and so on. And today, the pro-Russian resources affiliated with the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation published this video where we can see how exactly the clashes for this small village were taking place. As usually, we can see lots of artillery strikes, lots of attacks with multiple launch rocket systems. Of course, the Russians were bombing this territory with aviation. And in the final part of this video, we can see at least 3 episodes when Russian soldiers were raising the Russian flag in different parts of the settlement. Based on this video, based on the report of the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, we came to the conclusion that the settlement of Oleksiivka was captured by Russians completely. Furthermore, I would like to remind you that during the previous days, the Ukrainians made lots of attempts to cross the river of Volcha with the purpose to send reinforcements and reserves to stabilize the situation, but as we discussed in the previous videos, everything that crossed the river of Volcha was destroyed by Russian FPV drones. At the same time, after the end of the battle for this territory, the Russians are moving their focus further in the western direction. And today we got 2 very important videos from the settlement of Pokrovskaya. This is a key village, key settlement in this area. So this is the first video that was published today by pro-Russian resources. And here we can see how Russians were bombing and attacking the main bridge in this area with FABs, with artillery. And as you can see, the Russians managed to damage the bridge and probably even to destroy it. Later, we got another video published by pro-Ukraine resources, and here we can see how Ukrainians on the ground were making a video regarding the situation in this area. As you can see, that the bridge was badly damaged, and most likely this bridge would be destroyed in coming days. As of now, we see that Ukrainian vehicles are no longer able to use this bridge for logistic purposes. Maybe Ukrainian soldiers still have possibilities for this, but not vehicles. And also, it's just a matter of time when Russians will destroy the bridge completely with another missile or another FAB attack. We see that the Russians are ruining the Ukrainian logistic in this area with the purpose to reduce their logistic capabilities. Obviously, this will allow the Russians to move further in the western direction much faster and with less resistance from the Ukrainian side. And I would like to remind you that the settlement of Gulai Polya, this one is the key settlement in this eastern Zaporozhye offensive operation, and this is exactly what the Russians are tasked for, to capture the settlement of Gulai Polya, and this can lead to complete collapse of the entire defense in the Zaporozhye direction, and then the Russians most likely will launch their next offensive operation, this time in the direction of the city of Orekhov. But the next offensive operation most likely will be started at the beginning of 2026, of course, if this war will continue. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. During the previous 24 hours, we received lots of very important updates from this territory. So once again, I would like to remind you that around on 9th or 10th of October of 2025, the Russians launched their major offensive operation in the southern part of the Pokrovsk agglomeration with the purpose to establish complete control over the territory. So the map that you can see right now is the configuration of the map by the end of the 10th of October of 2025, and this is approximately the moment when the Russians launched their offensive. And first, according to several pro-Russian resources, the armored force of the Russian Federation managed to break through Ukraine defense and to capture the settlement of Kazatska. Furthermore, the Russians captured the settlement of Kazatska and managed to move even further in the western direction, and Russians entered the eastern part of the settlement by the name of Mirnograd. By the end of the 12th of October of 2025, a few more resources confirmed this information, and we received the first video, this one, where we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians on the territory of the settlement by the name of Balagan, which is also a part of this territory. So this is the situation by the end of the 12th of October of 2025. By the end of the 13th of October, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation confirmed that the village of Moskovskaya, or the settlement of Kazatskaya, was captured by Russians as a result of decisive actions of the group of forces center. The next day, the Russians confirmed that they also managed to secure and to capture the settlement by the name of Balagan. So as you can see, during the period of time between the 10th and the 14th of October of 2025, the main activities, the main offensive activities of the armored force of the Russian Federation were taking place on the eastern flank of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. Furthermore, several resources reported from the settlement of Balagan, the Russians managed to break through Ukrainian defense and to answer the Mirnograd citadel, which is located in the northern part of the city. So we are talking about this territory. Once again, several pro-Russian resources reported that as a result of fast lightning attack, the Russians managed to dig in deeper in this part of the city. So this is the situation by the end of the 14th of October. And today, during the 15th of October of 2025, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that as a result of active offensive actions, the units of the Group of Forces Center also managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Novopavlovka. And few hours later, several pro-Russian resources affiliated with the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation published this video where we can see how exactly the clashes for this settlement were taking place. Here we can see how Russians were attacking Ukrainian positions, and in the final part of this video we can see just one episode, how a Russian soldier established the Russian flag in the central part of the settlement. Based on this video and based on the report of the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, we adjusted this part of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. And now it's become clear what exactly the Russians are tasked for. As we can see, the Russians began offensive operation in the direction of the southern part of the settlement of Mirnograd from the southwestern, from the eastern and the southeastern directions. And as we understand, the Russian task is to establish complete control over this red line. So basically to cut the southern part of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. If Russians are able to capture these territories, including this central Mirnograd citadel, then the Russians would be able to cut and cauldron the northern part of the city of Mirnograd, because from this configuration of the front line, the distance between the southern positions of the armored force of the Russian Federation and the northern ones would be less than 8 kilometers, which is already nothing for Russian FPV drone operators. This will lead to complete collapse, and Ukrainian positions in this area will fall, probably not automatically, but within the next weeks or just several days. So this is the situation in this direction. The situation, as we can see, is very difficult for the armored forces of Ukraine. The Russians continue their offensive, but at the same time, the Ukrainians are showing at least some resistance. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Siversk and the Kupiansk, the Siversk and Liman direction. As you can see, during the previous 24 hours, we received lots of updates. The Russians are basically reducing till ruins the city of Siversk, but another day without changes on the ground. And the reason of this is that currently the main clashes are taking place for the settlement of Dronovka. Today, several pro-Russian resources reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to secure the part of Dronovka which is located to the north of these railways. So at least 30% of the settlement is already under complete Russian control. Currently, the Russians, according to information we have, began advancing along the river of Seversky Donets in the direction of the settlement by the name of Zakitna. So Russians are trying to outflank Ukraine main positions and to get this territory, to dig in deeper and to begin offensive operation in the direction of the settlement of Zakitne. If Russians can do this, they will be able to cut logistic of the settlement of Yampol, of Ukrainian resistance in the settlement of Yampol, and this can lead to probably very huge problems for Ukrainian contingent on the territory of the city of Siversk itself. So let's keep an eye on this area, because most likely in coming days we might get lots of very interesting updates. Furthermore, we got another very interesting video from T0514 road. This used to be a very important road of Ukrainian logistic. Here we can see the bridge and the pontoon bridge, and both were destroyed as a result of clashes. The bridge, the big one, was destroyed in 2022 during the first and the second battles of the city of Liman, and later, after the Ukrainian counteroffensive, Kharkiv counteroffensive operation, the Ukrainians created and established the pontoon bridge, this one. But today, according to this video, we can see that the Russians destroyed this bridge completely. And according to information we have, the Russians are paying attention right now to the Ukrainian logistics. They're trying to destroy every single river crossing along the river of Seversky Donetsk, but according to information we have, the Ukrainians have at least 5 or 6 pontoon bridges in the vicinity of Svetogorsk, and the settlement of Svetogorsk is the main logistic hub for the armed forces of Ukraine for their defense purposes of the settlements of Drobushev and Liman. And as for this territory, the Russians are also advancing, and today we got report that Russians answered the settlement of Drobushev, and the Russians improved their positions to the southwest from the river of Nitrius. So we are waiting for adjustments, additional changes, but it seems that in coming days we're going to receive lots of different updates on the ground, and the map would be changed significantly. As for the northern directions, currently the sources are saying that the situation is getting worse and worse for the armed forces of Ukraine on the Russian side of the river Oskol. Today, several resources reported that the Russians, during the clearing operation, managed to find lots of positions, abandoned positions of the armed forces of Ukraine, where Ukrainians were completely exhausted. They didn't have food and they didn't have water, because according to information we have, the only way to supply the contingent of the armed forces of Ukraine on this bank of the river is using drones. But Russians control the western bank, and so that is why the Ukrainians are very limited in these possibilities. So that is why we can say that obviously when winter comes, when most likely November comes, Ukrainians will not be able to hold their defense on this bank of the river anymore, without water, without hot, without food, and most likely somewhere by the end of November, I believe that the city of Kupiansk and the entire, let's say, eastern bank of the river of Oskol would collapse and would be captured by Russia. As for the Kharkiv direction, the most important updates are coming from the city of Volchansk. Today, several pro-Russian resources reported that up to 70% of the city of Volchansk is already captured by the armed forces of the Russian Federation. So the Russians are moving, and it seems that the battle for this territory is also going to be finished in coming days. And let's discuss the situation in the Sumy direction. We haven't been talking about this territory for a very long period of time, and now we start receiving first updates that Ukrainians continue their counter-offensive operation. Today, pro-Ukraine resources reported and neutral mappers reported that the Russians were forced to fall back from the southern part of the settlement of Oleksiivka. Furthermore, by the end of the 15th of October of 2025, few more resources reported that the Russians abandoned the settlement of Oleksiivka completely. So most likely coming days, the Ukrainians would be able to secure this area, and they will continue offensive operation further towards the border with the Russian Federation. So as for the Sumy direction, we see that Ukrainians are counter-attacking. Their counter-offensive operation is very slow, but during this counter-offensive, the Ukrainians have already restored control over the settlements of Kondratovka and Andreevka, and now it's time for the settlement of Oleksiivka. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.